It was a cold, dark afternoon, one of those that sneak through the cracks and give you goosebumps. The last thing I imagined when I said goodbye to my husband at the airport. Between rushing and last-minute calls, that was what awaited me when I returned home. Silence enveloped me, and all I wanted was to take refuge in the warmth of a shower and disconnect from the world for a few hours. But when I entered the living room, I found an unexpected scene. The dim light barely illuminated the figure of my father-in-law, who was sitting there in the armchair, watching me in the darkness. The faint aroma of tobacco floated in the air. Someone had smoked something strange because no one at home had that habit. My surprise was evident, but he maintained his calm posture, without moving or saying anything. He just looked at me as if he was waiting for something about me, something that I still did not understand. For an eternal second, his eyes met mine, and I felt that I had crossed a barrier that I should not touch. His expression was different from the one I knew. There was something there that made me feel better. He was uneasy, as if he was hiding a secret that he wanted to share with me, but in a way that I couldn't quite figure out. I asked, trying to break the silence that was beginning to weigh like a burden in the environment. He smiled an enigmatic smile and shrugged his shoulders. There was no sign of concern on his face, more like a kind of curiosity that I found difficult to bear. "I'm glad to see you back," he replied with a slow, almost whispering voice. He slowly got up from the chair and took a few steps towards me. Without taking his eyes off mine, I felt a lump in my throat, a mix of uncertainty and anxiety that paralyzed me. When I saw that he didn't stop watching me, I realized that my whole body was tense. I tried to calm down. I had no real reasons to feel uncomfortable. He was my father-in-law, after all, someone I trusted, with whom I had a cordial relationship. However, that night there was something in him that I didn't recognize, something that was manifested in his gaze, in the calm with which he moved in the silence between us. Suddenly his eyes lowered to my lips and looked back into my eyes as if he was waiting for a sign from me. I stood still, not knowing how to react to the weight of his gaze. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like an eternity. I didn't want to move, and at the same time I wanted that moment to end. It was then that it happened, with a naturalness that disarmed me. He came a little closer, shortening the distance between us. I did nothing to stop him. I simply stood there, not knowing how to react or what to think. He leaned slightly, and before I could process what was happening, I felt his lips brushing mine, barely a whisper, an almost imperceptible caress. There was nothing more than that arose, but it was enough for the air to freeze around us. I felt a slight tremor running through me as I instinctively stepped back in an attempt to distance myself from what had just happened. He pulled away, but he didn't stop looking at me, with an expression that I found impossible to decipher. There was no anger or regret on his face, but a strange calm that made me question if what had happened had been real or just an illusion caused by my mind. Finally he broke the silence. "Sorry, I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." His words seemed sincere, but something in his tone told me that there was nothing casual at that moment. Still, I forced myself to smile and respond with a slight nod, as if nothing had happened, although inside me I knew that something had changed. The next morning was a strange contrast. The sunlight came through the windows, soft and warm, as if trying to erase the intensity of the night before. I got up early, hoping that the coffee and the morning routine would clear the confusing thoughts that were hovering in my head. But when I entered the kitchen, there was my father-in-law with such a calm expression that it almost made me doubt if what had happened the night before was real or just a dream. "Good morning," he said with a light smile, almost carefree, as if everything was absolutely normal. I returned the greeting, trying to appear natural. Although I knew that my hands were shaking slightly, he seemed to notice it, because his gaze stopped a second longer than necessary on my face and then returned to his coffee. I pressed my lips together, taking a deep breath. The tension floated in the air, but he behaved in such a natural way that it almost made me feel ridiculous for thinking so much about what had happened. After a few seconds he broke the silence. "Did you sleep well?" he asked with such a casual tone that I felt a slight chill. There was nothing out of place in his question, but something in the way he asked it made me doubt. I nodded, trying to sound convincing, although I was not sure I had slept not even a single hour. My mind had gone over the moment of the previous night over and overlooking for an explanation, an answer to what I had felt to. Why had I not reacted? Why had I not moved away? Why didn't I say anything? He kept talking, apparently not noticing my discomfort. I'm glad you have some free time this weekend. It's good to have some company in this house. His comment was almost casual, but the weight of his words left me with an uncomfortable feeling. I watched him as he took a sip of his coffee with that same calm on his face. I couldn't help my thoughts going back to the night before, to the moment his lips brushed mine, to that instant when I stood paralyzed, not knowing how to react. I tried to shake off those thoughts and concentrate on the conversation in the routine. Yes, it's good to have a break, I answered, although I couldn't help my voice sounding lower than usual. He seemed to notice it and smiled, a slight smile but loaded with something I couldn't decipher. You know, sometimes a change of air does us good. It makes us see things in a different way, don't you think? He said, his words floating in the air, as if looking for some reaction in me. The discomfort began to grow in my inside, but I kept a calm expression, nodding silently. I knew there was a message hidden in his words, something that I would no longer understand, but that made me sensible. Exposed. When I finished breakfast, I tried to distract myself with tasks of the day. I went out to the garden, hoping that I'd choose in plants and the fresh mead my but still far from his presence. I felt that his words were repeating in my head like an echo at midday. He approached the garden, watching me in silence for a moment before speaking. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? He said, his voice so calm that it almost made me smile. Yes, it is, I answered without looking up. I focused on the plants in the soil between my fingers, on anything that could distract me. However, his next question surprised me. Do you miss those days when everything seemed easier? The question hit me, and I couldn't help but look up, finding his eyes fixed on me, attentive as if he expected a sincere answer. There was something in his tone that made me feel like he knew a part of me that no one else had seen, something that not even I fully understood. I'm not sure. You whisper. It's normal. Sometimes we hold on to things for fear of letting go, even though we know that they are not the same anymore. He said, his words softly but full of a truth that made me uncomfortable. That comment left me silent. He was touching on a subject that I had never dared to face, a truth that I had avoided for a long time, and at that moment I realized that he knew, that he understood more than he was willing to say. At the end of the afternoon, as I finished arranging the plants, I felt like my mind was somewhere else. I thought about his words, on how had he managed to reach that part of me that I had always kept hidden, even from myself. When I entered the house, I saw him in the kitchen preparing something light for dinner. I couldn't help the feeling that something was changing between us, that an invisible bond had formed without me having wanted it. Although I knew it was a strange situation, a part of me couldn't deny that he attracted me, as if I was looking for something I couldn't find in my daily life. Night fell, and as the house sank into silence, I understood that despite the confusion, I couldn't get my thoughts away from him. As the days went by, I tried to get away from those thoughts that haunted me, but the more I tried, the stronger he became. I saw his presence in my mind every time I entered the kitchen or passed through the living room. I felt his eyes on me, calm and observant. He didn't say anything out of the ordinary, and yet in every word there seemed to be something hidden, a message that only I could grasp. I decided to leave the house, get some air, and get away from that tension that was consuming me inside. I sent a message to an old friend, someone who had always been there in my difficult moments. I had been seeing him for a long time, but I was hoping that a little chat with him would help me clear my mind. When he answered that he was free, I felt a small spark of relief. We met in a cafe in the center of the city, a small and cozy place where we used to spend the afternoons, and other times when I saw him I felt that a part of me came back to life, as if that familiar atmosphere gave me back the person I had been before. We talked about trivial things at first, about memories of how our lives had changed. I tried to concentrate on what he was saying, but my mind wandered, remembering recent moments, the glances of my father-in-law, that constant presence that seemed to accompany me everywhere. After a while we stayed in silence. He looked at me as if waiting for me to say something important, something that would explain why I had felt the need to look for him. It was then that I felt an impulse, something that I could not control. I leaned towards him, getting closer until my lips touched his in a brief, almost timid kiss. He answered for a second, but then He pulled away with a surprised expression on his face. I can't do. This, he whispered without looking me in the eyes. I felt an emptiness in my chest, a mix of embarrassment and disappointment. My hands were shaking and I didn't know what to say. I had hoped that he would be a refuge, someone to lean on in this confusing moment, but his words made it clear to me that for him things had changed. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to me, I managed to say, although I knew that my words wouldn't be enough. He smiled sadly and took my hand for a moment, giving it a gentle squeeze before letting it go. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said in a kind but distant tone, as if he had already said goodbye to me. I stayed there watching him as he got up and left without looking back. When I was left alone at that table, I felt the weight of reality fall on me. I knew that something in my life was broken that I was looking for, something that I couldn't find in the people around me, but that feeling of emptiness grew bigger and bigger, as if everything was slipping away from my control. I returned home that night feeling more alone than ever. The city was silent and the streetlights barely illuminated the way back. I arrived late, hoping to find the house in complete calm, immersed in the usual silence. But when I entered, I heard some footsteps. My father-in-law was there waiting for me in the living room, as if he knew that I would return with my spirits in pieces. Everything was fine, he asked with that same calmness that disarmed me, as if he could see through me and know exactly what was happening to me. I nodded my head without knowing what to say. I didn't want to show him my vulnerability, but I felt that he already knew it, that he knew that I had no refuge anywhere else. I approached the sofa and let myself fall exhausted. He sat next to me in silence and didn't say nothing for a few minutes, seemed to wait for me to speak, but I didn't have the words to express the chaos in my mind. You didn't find what you expected. True, he said, finally breaking the silence. I felt a lump in my throat and I looked down, unable to answer. I was ashamed of the clarity of his words, the way he managed to put into words what I couldn't even admit. Sometimes we realize that what we are looking for is closer than we think, he continued in a tone that was almost a whisper. I looked at him again, and in his eyes I found something different. There was no judgment or reproach, just one that made me feel exposed, but at the same time comforted. It was a strange feeling, as if he was the only one who could see the part of me that I myself tried to hide, and somehow that made me feel less alone. Maybe you murmur, he smiled barely, and in that moment, without warning, he leaned towards me, brushing his lips with mine in a brief kiss, soft but full of an intensity that left me breathless. This time it was not an impulse or a reaction, was a choice, a silent answer to the question that floated between us. The kiss was brief, almost a whisper, and when he pulled away, he looked at me in silence. He said nothing, but his gaze held an unspoken promise, an invitation that needed no words. My heart was beating strongly, and I knew that something had changed forever between us, that there was no turning back. However, the confusion grew inside me. I got up from the couch, still feeling the weight of his gaze, and mumbled something vague about being tired. I walked away from him up the stairs to my room, where I let myself fall on the bed, trying to understand what had just happened. I knew I had crossed an invisible line, one that I could not undo. As I lay in the darkness of my room, listening to the silence of the house, I understood that I was entering an unknown territory, one in which there were no answers or assurances. The next morning came with a feeling of strangeness, as if the weight of the previous night refused to leave me. I got up early, seeking comfort in the routine, trying to convince myself that everything was still the same, but I knew that was a lie. The memory of his kiss was still there, as real as the day that began, and I felt the weight of something that could not change. He was in the kitchen when I came down, making himself a coffee with his usual calm. When he saw me come in, he gave me a light smile, as if nothing was different, but I knew the truth, and I hesitated a moment before sitting in front of him. I wanted to avoid his gaze, to get away from anything that would remind me of what had happened. However, he did not leave me much room to escape. Did you rest well? He asked in a casual tone, his eyes watching me with an intensity that made me feel vulnerable. I nodded, forcing it made chaos. He held my gaze for a moment more, as if he were looking for something in me before returning to his coffee. Everything in him seemed calculated, from his words to his gestures, and I felt how the tension grew in my chest. Sometimes it is Difficult to find peace even at home, he said his words suddenly. Resonating in the silence of the kitchen, I did not know how to respond. I wasn't sure if he was referring to me or himself, or if it was some casual comment. But his tone was ambiguous enough to make me doubt after a few seconds. He got up, taking his cup of coffee, and went out to the garden, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my thoughts. I took advantage of the moment of solitude to try to clear my mind. I immersed myself in the tasks of the day, trying to forget, but the image of his face, of his words, and the kiss were still present. Impossible to ignore. My hands trembled when doing the simplest tasks, and every sound in the house seemed to amplify the tension that enveloped me. As the day progressed, I felt trapped between the I had to get away and a strange curiosity that I couldn't understand. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't help it. It was as if something inside me was resisting letting go. Although I knew that this wasn't leading to anything good. When evening fell, I saw him again in the garden, observing the plants in silence. His figure seemed almost melancholic to me, as if he too were trapped in thoughts that I couldn't share. Approached him cautiously, unable to resist the need to talk to him, to understand what was behind his calm. "Everything's okay?" I asked, breaking the silence with a barely audible voice. He slowly turned, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment I felt that time had stopped. There was no reproach in his gaze, but there was also no calmness that he usually showed. It was a different, deeper expression, as if something in him was also falling apart. "It all depends on what you think," he replied, his words loaded with a meaning that left me breathless. I didn't know how to respond, and he didn't seem to expect me to do so. Instead, he took a step towards me, breaking the distance between us. My first instinct was to back away, but my feet didn't move. I stood there silently, allowing the tension between us to speak for itself. "Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever find what we're really looking for," he said in a whisper. Almost to himself. His comment resonated in me like a confession, one I didn't expect to hear, and I felt a mix of understanding and vulnerability that I couldn't ignore. Without thinking, I looked down, unable to sustain his intensity. And for a moment everything else disappeared. There was something in his words that awakened in me a feeling of empathy, as if he too was lost, searching for something he couldn't find. We stood like that in a silence loaded with meaning until he moved away, his eyes getting lost in the horizon. I stood there watching him in silence, wondering if I would ever truly understand what it was that he was looking for that night. As the house sank into darkness, I felt everything get heavier. Every shadow on the walls seemed to hold secrets I didn't want to face, and my thoughts returned over and over again at him, at the way he looked at me, at the words he didn't say but that floated in the air. I wondered if I would ever be able to free myself from that feeling of bewilderment, from that invisible bond that seemed to unite us in a silent pact. In the middle of that sleepless night, I decided to send a message to my friend from college, someone I had always trusted and with whom I could speak without reservations. But as I wrote the message, I realized that I couldn't explain to him what I felt. It was something I couldn't put into words, a mix of guilt and curiosity that not even I understood. I finally put the phone away, resigned to dealing with my own thoughts. The next morning he went back to acting as if everything was normal, as if the tension between us didn't exist, and somehow his calmness was harder to bear than anything else. I found myself walking around the house with a constant restlessness, waiting for some change, some sign that everything had been a misunderstanding, but his attitude remained the same, calm, almost indifferent. However, deep down from his gaze I noticed something different, a glint that I had not seen before. I could not define it, but I knew that something was changing between us, to the aloe that we both avoided facing that afternoon. While he was in the garden, I observed his figure from the window, and I wondered if I would ever find the answer to all the questions that now hovered in my mind. It was as if an invisible veil had been installed between us, and I couldn't decide if I wanted him to stay or disappear. And as the afternoon went on and the light began to fade, I felt a strange calm. As if for the first time in days I could find a respite. I knew things would never be the same again, but for a moment I allowed myself to forget the weight of my thoughts, and I simply observed the world around me as if in that small moment I could escape. From everything that afternoon when I returned home, I noticed something different in the environment. Everything seemed quieter than usual, as if the air was charged with a tension I couldn't identify. I took off my coat and left my things in the entrance, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort that enveloped me, but as soon as I took a few steps towards the living room, I saw him standing there staring at me. His figure seemed more imposing than usual, and his eyes had an intensity one hadn't seen before. I tried to act normal, pretending I didn't notice the seriousness in his gaze. I walked towards the kitchen looking for something to do, but he followed me. Without saying a word, his presence was heavy, as if each step of his resonated in the silence of the house. Finally, I turned to him, ready to face whatever was happening. "All right?" I asked, trying to keep calm in my voice, even though I felt my heart was beating hard. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze stopped on me, scanning me as if he was trying to read my thoughts. For an eternal second we stayed like that in a tense silence that only increased my discomfort. Finally, he took a step towards me, breaking the distance between us. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," he said in a low tone, almost a whisper. His words made a shiver run down my spine. I tried to look away, but something in his voice kept me trapped, as if each word of his had the power to immobilize me. I didn't know what to say. Deep inside me, I had also thought at that moment about the intensity of what I had felt, but I wasn't ready to face reality of my own thoughts, much less his. I began, but the words stuck in my throat. I had no answer, nor did I even know if I wanted to have one. He took another step towards me, getting close enough for me to feel his presence in an almost tangible way. My first impulse was to back away from the tension that was building between us, but my feet refused to move. It was as if a part of me was resisting escape, even though I knew the right thing to do would be to do so. "You don't have to say anything," he continued with a calm that contrasted with the tumult inside me. "I just want you to know that I'm here, that I understand what you feel, even if you yourself can't understand it." His voice was soft, but his words had a weight that left me breathless. I found myself trapped between confusion and the desire to understand what was really going on inside me. I watched him in silence, trying to find some indication that all of this was nothing more than a misunderstanding, a mistake that could disappear if I closed my eyes and I was concentrating on something else. But his gaze told me that there was no turning back, that we both knew too much how to pretend that nothing had happened. "I don't know if I can continue like this," I admitted, surprised by my own confession. It was the first time I expressed out loud the chaos I felt inside, and doing so left me vulnerable, exposed to his judgment. To my surprise, he didn't show even a hint of reproach. On the contrary, his gaze seemed full of an understanding that I didn't expect. He came even closer, and for an instant I thought he was going to say something, some word that could ease the weight of my confession, but instead of that, he simply extended his hand and he touched my shoulder, a gesture that, although simple, conveyed a closeness that left me breathless. We stayed like that in silence without needing to say anything else. I felt that time stopped, that the world was reduced to that small space. There were not enough words between us to describe what was happening, but there was no need to look for them at that moment. Everything seemed clear. Even if I could not understand it completely, I finally moved away. Breaking contact, I knew I had to do it. I could not continue to feed a connection that would only complicate things more. He looked at me silently, as if he understood what I was thinking, and he did not try to stop me. He simply observed me with that same calm that disconcerted me so much. That night I locked myself in my room, trying to process what had happened. I knew that something in me had changed. I could not ignore the reality of my feelings, but I could not allow myself to cross that line. I was aware of the risks, of the consequences that a wrong decision could bring, but the connection I felt with him was so strong that it was difficult for me to fight against it. The next morning I tried to act like if nothing had happened. I immersed myself in my tasks, trying to distract myself from concentrating on anything that would help me keep my mind occupied, but every time I saw him I felt my resolve wavering, that a Part of me was still clinging to the possibility that things could be different. He, however, behaved with the same calmness as always, as if he didn't notice my confusion. But I knew that wasn't the case. I could see in his gaze that he was as aware as I was of what was happening between us, that I also felt that silent tension that kept us united even when we tried to ignore it. The afternoon fell, and the silence in the house became almost unbearable. I was about to go up to my room when I heard his footsteps approaching. I turned around, meeting his gaze again, that gaze that seemed to see through my own doubts. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said, as if he read my thoughts. "I just want you to know that I'm here for whatever you need." His voice was soft, reassuring, and for a moment I felt a part of me relax, as if his presence was an anchor in the midst of the chaos I felt. But at the same time, that calm scared me, because I knew I was getting closer and closer to a point of no return. I nodded, unable to say anything else. I turned towards the stairs and went up to my room, letting the silence fill the house again. I knew I was playing with fire, that every step I took brought me closer to a decision that would change everything. But for some reason I couldn't walk away. I couldn't ignore the connection I felt, even though I knew it would only bring me more self. That night, as I curled up in bed, I heard the silence of the house, that silence that seemed to speak to me of all the things I didn't want to face. I knew that the decision was in my hands, that only I could define my path, but at the same time I felt that destiny had put me in this place at this moment, and that I only had to wait in silence for time to give me an answer. The weekend arrived, wrapped in an air of unusual calm, almost deceptive. I had spent the last few days avoiding any moment alone with he. Immersed me in household chores, in work, in anything that would take me away from that feeling of emptiness and tension. But as if fate insisted on confronting me with the inevitable, that afternoon we were alone at home. My husband had gone away once again, and the absence of his steps, of his voice, seemed to echo off the walls. I went out into the garden, hoping to find some peace among the outdoor plants where I could feel less trapped. But even there, in the farthest corner of the house, his presence felt close. I was aware of every sound, of every rustle of leaves, as if everything was watching. And then I heard his footsteps approaching slowly and surely. I turned to find him standing, watching me from a safe distance, but with an intensity that broke any physical barrier. "Can I join you?" he asked, softly, as if he measured his words, but his eyes said something completely different. I nodded without saying anything, aware that my silence was an answer in itself. He came over and sat beside me, looking at the horizon instead of at me. For a few seconds the silence between us was almost comfortable, as if we both understood that it was not necessary to speak to understand what was happening. But then his voice broke the calm, dragging out the words with a sincerity that I fell apart. "I can't ignore what I feel. I can't pretend there isn't something between us, and I know you feel it too," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if he was afraid to break the fragility of that moment. The words hit me like a truth I had been avoiding, but that, when said out loud, felt as inescapable as the air I breathed. I couldn't answer. My mind was in chaos, trying to find an excuse, some logical reason that would help me stop the inevitable. But there was no logic in what I felt, in what we both knew was there, as palpable as the space that separated us. "What are we going to do with this?" I finally asked, my voice broken, laden with a vulnerability that I hadn't wanted to show. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flash of doubt in his eyes, a hesitation that I had never noticed before. I knew that he too was crossing a line from which there would be no return. I knew that, just like me, I was fighting the impulse to do what was forbidden, to let myself be carried away by something that I both understood, but we didn't want to admit it. "I don't know," he answered in a whisper, "but I want you to know that I'm here for whatever you decide, for whatever you need." Those words were more intense than I expected. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of something concrete. It was simply a show of understanding and acceptance of what was happening. But at the same time, that acceptance scared me, because it meant that we were both willing to move forward, to see how far that which united us would take us. I felt my heart beating strongly, each beat resonating in my ears, in my mind, in my entire being. I wanted to say something, find some answer that would help me understand, but there were no Words. All there was the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. That moment would mark a before and after in our lives. Finally he got up, breaking the spell, and turned towards the house. I saw him walk away, each step of his resonating in the silence of the garden, and I knew that although we had both avoided physical contact, something much deeper had happened. Something much deeper had happened between us, something that couldn't be undone. That night, as I tried to sleep, I felt like my mind couldn't find peace. Everything I had felt, everything that I had avoided, was accumulating in my chest, in my mind, and I knew I was losing control. I knew that no matter how much I tried to ignore it, that was real as life itself. At dawn, I found myself again alone in the kitchen, immersed in thoughts that I couldn't sort out. I was pouring myself a cup of coffee when I heard the door open. He was there, looking at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made me understand that everything I had tried to avoid was about to happen. "I think we should talk," he said with a seriousness that made me feel like the ground was shaking under my feet. We sat at the table facing each other, and the silence settled between us, dense and full of contained emotions. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt that whatever happened at that moment would change our lives forever. "I know this is complicated," he began with a tone that reflected the same internal struggle I felt, "but I can't pretend anymore. I can't go on like this." Those words made me understand the seriousness of the situation. We were on the verge of something that I didn't fully understand, but that attracted us with a force that seemed impossible to stop. Yet, deep inside me, I knew there were things at stake that we couldn't ignore. Just as I was about to answer, when I felt like I was finally going to admit what I felt, the front door swung open. My husband came in with his face marked by the tiredness of the trip, and his gaze settled on us with an expression of surprise. I felt that time was stopping, that the air became thick, and that everything we had built in that moment of tension collapsed in a second. My father-in-law, stood up immediately, trying to regain his composure, but his expression told me that he understood the seriousness of the situation. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating so hard that I was afraid he was going to give me away. My husband looked at us without fully understanding what was happening, but with an expression of suspicion that froze my blood. "Everything is okay here?" he asked with a voice full of uncertainty. I nodded, forcing a smile that felt empty while he watched his father as if searching for some answer on his face. I felt that the silence was lengthening, that every second was a confirmation of everything I had tried to deny, and then, without further ado, my husband looked away and murmured, "Well, I guess we'll leave it for another moment." He went to his room, leaving us in that uncomfortable silence and loaded with contained emotions. When the door closed behind him, I looked at my father-in-law without knowing what to do, without knowing if that moment had marked the end of everything or the beginning of something that we could not escape at that moment. I understood that our lives are about to change forever.